He'd worked at the same diner for 20 years. Even the owner didn't know his last name until that evening when an old news story came on TV. 2004, Iraq operation, missing soldiers, and the face on screen was exactly his. Not Mike the waiter, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, the man erased from the missing list. Welcome to Honor Untold. Before we tell this powerful story of guilt, redemption, and hidden sacrifice, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us keep these voices alive. Tony's Diner sat on Route 66 just outside Chicago, wedged between a gas station and an auto parts store. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and the smell of bacon grease that never quite left the air. It was the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and locals came for comfort food that reminded them of better times. Mike had worked there for exactly 20 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting. He showed up every morning at 6 a.m., tied his apron, filled the coffee pot, and began another day of taking orders from people who never really saw him. At 45, Mike Rodriguez looked older than his years. His brown hair had gone gray at the temples, and his face carried lines that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy thoughts. He moved with a slight limp. Nothing dramatic, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Most people weren't. The owner, Tony Castellano, had hired Mike on the spot 2 decades ago. No references, no background check. Just a man who needed work and another man who needed help. Tony's paperwork listed him simply as Mike, with no last name. Cash payments, no questions asked. It worked for both of them. Mike's reliable, Tony would tell people. Never calls in sick, never causes trouble, always on time. Don't know what I could do without him. The regular customers knew him as the quiet guy who remembered how they liked their coffee and never got their orders wrong. He wasn't unfriendly, just present. He did his job, took his breaks alone, and at the end of each shift, he'd untie his apron and disappear into the Chicago streets like he'd never been there at all. Every morning followed the same pattern. Mike would arrive in worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt, change into his uniform, and begin the ritual of setting up for another day. Coffee brewing, grill warming, chairs down from tables. The movements were automatic, muscle memory from 2 decades of repetition. Sarah, the young waitress who worked the afternoon shift, sometimes tried to make conversation. Mike, you ever think about doing anything else? I mean, you've been here forever. He'd smile, a tired smile that never quite reached his eyes, and say, "This is good work, Sarah. Honest work. But don't you want more? Travel? Adventure?" Mike would pause, his hand unconsciously moving to his left forearm, where an old scar showed through his shirt sleeve. "I've had enough adventure for one lifetime." The scar was deep, jagged, the kind that came from something sharp and hot tearing through flesh. When customers noticed it, Mike would say it was from a kitchen accident years ago. The lie came so easily now that he almost believed it himself. Dave, the cook, was a Vietnam vet who'd seen his share of scars. He'd glance at Mike's arm sometimes, with the knowing look of one soldier recognizing another's wounds. But he never asked questions. In a place like Tony's, everyone had something they were running from or trying to forget. Mike lived in a studio apartment 6 blocks from the diner. Sparse furniture, No decorations, nothing that spoke of a life beyond survival. The only personal item was a wooden box he kept in his closet, sealed with a small padlock. Inside were documents he hadn't looked at in years: discharge papers, medical records, and a single photograph of three young soldiers smiling at the camera. At night, when sleep wouldn't come, Mike would sit by his window and watch the city lights blur past. Sometimes he'd catch fragments of his old life in dreams: the sound of helicopters, the weight of body armor, the faces of men who trusted him to bring them home. He'd wake with his heart racing, his shirt soaked in sweat, the phantom pain in his arm burning, like the day he'd first felt shrapnel tear through muscle and bone. These were the moments when he questioned whether surviving had been a gift or a curse. The nightmares were always the same: the explosion, the screaming, the desperate attempt to drag his men to safety while his own blood painted the desert sand. And then the darkness, followed by waking up in a field hospital with doctors speaking Arabic and no way to contact his unit. The scar on Mike's forearm was just the visible reminder. The deeper wounds were carved into his soul, invisible to everyone around him. Survivor's guilt, the therapists would have called it. But Mike had never seen a therapist. He'd simply learned to carry the weight quietly, the way he carried everything else. During busy lunch rushes, when the diner filled with noise and chaos, Mike would sometimes freeze. The clatter of dishes became the sound of gunfire. The shouts from the kitchen became calls for medic. His hand would move instinctively to his scar, pressing against the old wound as if trying to hold something together that had been broken long ago. "You okay, Mike?" Sarah would ask when she noticed him standing motionless behind the counter. "Just tired," he'd say, forcing himself back to the present. Long morning? But it wasn't tiredness. It was the weight of carrying three names he'd never spoken aloud since returning home: Private Danny Morrison, 19, from Ohio; Specialist Carlos Vega, 22, from Texas; Corporal Jason Chen, 20, from California. They'd been his responsibility, his men, and he'd failed them in the desert outside Fallujah. March 15th started like any other day. The morning rush had ended, the lunch crowd was still hours away, and the diner had settled into his familiar rhythm. Mike was refilling salt shakers when Tony turned up the volume on the old TV mounted in the corner. And tonight, we continue our special series honoring fallen heroes with a look back at Operation Iraqi Freedom. 20 years later, some wounds are still healing, and some stories are just now being told. Mike's hands stilled on the salt shaker. He rarely paid attention to the news. It was just background noise, something to fill the silence between orders. But something about the reporter's tone made him look up. Among the cases that still haunt military families are the soldiers listed as missing in action, men who simply vanished during the chaos of combat, their fates unknown to this day. The screen filled with grainy photographs from military files, young faces in desert camouflage, service photos taken before deployment. Mike's chest tightened as memories he'd spent 20 years burying began to surface. One such case involves Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez and his three-man reconnaissance team, who disappeared during a patrol outside Fallujah in November 2004. Mike dropped the salt shaker. It hit the floor and shattered, white crystals spreading across the checkered tiles like scattered stars. But he didn't notice. His eyes were locked on the television screen, where his own face, 20 years younger, clean shaven, wearing sergeant stripes, stared back at him. The diner went silent. Sarah stopped wiping tables. Dave poked his head out of the kitchen. Tony stood frozen with a coffee pot in his hand, his mouth slightly open. On the screen, the reporter continued talking about missing soldiers and unresolved cases, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Mike? Tony's voice was barely a whisper. Is that, is that you? Mike couldn't move, couldn't breathe. For 20 years, he'd been invisible, anonymous, just another face in the crowd. Now his past was broadcast to anyone who cared to look, his secrets laid bare under the fluorescent lights of a roadside diner. The families of these missing soldiers continue to hold out hope, the reporter was saying, even as the years pass and official inquiries yield no new information. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a decorated non-commissioned officer, was last seen attempting to evacuate his wounded team members under heavy fire. Mike, Tony's voice was stronger now, more insistent. That's you, isn't it? Mike finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Yes, one word, after 20 years of silence, one word that changed everything. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Dave stepped fully into the dining room, his understanding clear in his weathered face. Tony set down the coffee pot with shaking hands. You were listed as missing in action, Tony said slowly. Your family, they think you're dead. Mike nodded, unable to trust his voice for anything more complex. Why? Sarah whispered. Why didn't you go home? Mike sat heavily in the nearest booth, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The weight he'd carried alone for 2 decades was about to be shared, and he wasn't sure he was strong enough to bear it. I couldn't, he said finally. I couldn't go home. But why? Tony sat across from him, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. Your family? They must have been devastated. Mike's hand moved to his scar, pressing against the old wound. Because I failed. My men, Danny, Carlos, Jason, they trusted me to bring them home, and I couldn't save them. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if a dam had burst after 20 years of holding back the flood. We were on patrol, routine reconnaissance, or so we thought. But we walked into an ambush. IED went off right under our vehicle. I was thrown clear, but the others... His voice broke. The others were trapped. Sarah had tears in her eyes. Dave's face was stone, but his hands were clenched into fists. Tony just listened, letting Mike speak words that had been bottled up for decades. I tried to get them out. The vehicle was on fire. There was small arms fire coming from everywhere, and I was bleeding from shrapnel wounds. But I tried. I got Danny out first. He was unconscious, but breathing. Then Carlos. Jason was pinned, and the fire was getting worse. Mike's voice dropped to a whisper. I was pulling Jason free when another explosion knocked me out. When I woke up, I was in an Iraqi hospital. Days had passed. The fire had... There was nothing left to save. The Iraqi doctors saved my life, but I had no way to contact my unit. The area was still under heavy fighting, and I was trapped behind enemy lines for weeks. When I finally made it to a safe zone, I learned that I'd been listed as killed in action, along with my team. Mike looked up at the faces around him. People who had known him for years, but had never really known him at all. I could have corrected the records. I could have gone home to my wife, Linda, and my son, Jake. But how do you face a family when you failed so completely? How do you look in the mirror knowing that 3 boys died because of your decisions? So I let them believe I was dead. I figured it would be easier for everyone that way. Linda could move on, find someone better. Jake could grow up with a hero for a father instead of a failure. Tony's voice was thick with emotion. Mike, you're not a failure. You tried to save them. You risked your life for your men. I tried, Mike repeated bitterly. But trying isn't enough when 3 families get folded flags instead of their sons. I made my way to Chicago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a fake ID that cost me everything I had. I've been here ever since, trying to, I don't know, atone, maybe, pay some kind of debt. Sarah wiped her eyes with her apron. But you've been punishing yourself for 20 years for something that wasn't your fault, wasn't it? Mike's laugh was harsh and bitter. I was the squad leader. I made the decision to take that route. I chose the path that led us into the ambush. You couldn't have known. Dave spoke for the first time, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of his own wartime experiences. None of us could have known. That's the hell of it. We make the best decisions we can with the information we have. And sometimes, good people die anyway. Easy words, Mike said. Harder to live with them. The diner fell quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Route 66. Mike stared at his hands. These hands that had served coffee and cleared tables for 20 years. Hands that had once held rifles and tried desperately to pull his men from a burning vehicle. Tony made a decision that would change everything. While Mike sat lost in his memories, Tony quietly slipped into his office and made a phone call to the number that had appeared on the screen during the news report, a tip line for families of missing soldiers. 20 minutes later, Tony's phone rang. Is this Tony's diner where Michael Rodriguez works? The woman's voice was shaking, desperate. Please, if he's there, I need to speak with him. I'm his wife. I mean, his. I was his wife, Linda Rodriguez. Tony looked through the office window at Mike, still sitting in the booth, staring at nothing. Ma'am, he's here. But this is very hard for him. It's been 20 years, Linda whispered, and Tony could hear her crying. 20 years of not knowing, of wondering, of hoping. My son grew up thinking his father was dead. Please, just tell him I'm coming. Tell him I love him. Tell him I never stopped believing he might still be alive. When Tony told Mike about the phone call, Mike's face went white. Number, I can't. I won't put them through this. Through what? Sarah demanded. Through having their husband and father back. Through having a broken man instead of a hero. Mike shot back. Through learning that the person they mourned was a coward who abandoned his family instead of facing them. You're not a coward, Dave said firmly. A coward wouldn't have spent 20 years carrying this guilt. A coward wouldn't have tried to save his men when he was wounded and under fire. But Mike was already untying his apron, preparing to run again. 20 years in Chicago, and he was ready to disappear, just like he had from that hospital in Iraq. Where will you go? Tony asked quietly. Mike stopped, his hand on the door handle. He realized he had no answer. He'd been running for so long that he'd forgotten how to stop. Linda Rodriguez walked into Tony's diner at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. That would divide Mike's life into before and after. She was 48 now, her dark hair streaked with gray, but her eyes were the same eyes that had haunted Mike's dreams. for 20 years. Behind her was a young man who looked like a younger version of Mike himself, Jake, the son who had been 5 years old when his father died in Iraq and was now 30, wearing an army uniform with sergeant stripes of his own. Mike stood frozen by the coffee station, a pot of decaf in his trembling hands. 20 years of imagined reunions had never prepared him for this moment. Michael. Linda's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the diner like thunder. Mike set down the coffee pot and turned to face his past. Linda, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She crossed the diner in quick steps and did something he never expected. She slapped him. The sound echoed off the checkered walls, and every customer in the place turned to stare. 20 years, she said, her voice shaking with anger and grief. 20 years of thinking you were dead. 20 years of raising our son alone. 20 years of grieving for a man who was serving coffee in Chicago. Mike took the blow without flinching. He deserved it. Deserved worse. But then Linda's anger broke, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing against his chest. 20 years, she repeated. But this time, it was a lament, not an accusation. Jake stood back, watching his father hold his mother, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. When Linda finally stepped back, Jake moved forward, and Mike saw himself as he had been at that age, young, idealistic, certain of his place in the world. So you just left us? Jake's voice was controlled, but Mike could hear the fury underneath. You let us think you were dead while you played house with some diner in Chicago. I didn't play house, Mike said quietly. I survived. There's a difference. Survived? Jake's control cracked. What about us? What about Mom crying herself to sleep for years? What about me growing up without a father because you were too much of a coward to come home? The words hit harder than Linda's slap. Mike looked at his son. This young man who wore the same uniform Mike had worn, who had chosen to serve, despite believing his father had died in service. You're right, Mike said. I was a coward, not in Iraq, but afterward. I was so afraid of disappointing you, of being less than the hero you thought you'd lost, that I became something worse, a ghost. Jake's anger wavered, replaced by something more complicated. I joined the army because of you, because I thought you were a hero who died saving his men. You joined the army because you're a better man than I am, Mike replied, and that has nothing to do with me. Over the next several hours, as Tony's diner became an impromptu family counseling session, the full story came out. Mike told them about the ambush, about his desperate attempts to save his men, about waking up in an Iraqi hospital with no way to contact his unit. He told them about the months of recovery, the fake identity, the decision to let his family believe he was dead, rather than burden them with his failure and guilt. Linda listened with tears streaming down her face. Jake's anger gradually gave way to understanding, though the hurt remained. The army told us you died a hero, Linda said. They said you sacrificed yourself trying to save your men. They lied, Mike said bitterly. I failed. 3 good men died because I made the wrong call. No, the voice came from the diner's entrance, where 2 men in dress uniforms stood. Mike recognized them immediately. Colonel James Patterson, who had been his company commander, and Master Sergeant William Hayes, who had served in his platoon. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Patterson said, formally, then smiled. Mike, We've been looking for you for a long time. What really happened that day in Fallujah? Colonel Patterson said, settling into the booth across from Mike, was exactly what the army said. You walked into a perfectly planned ambush that intelligence never saw coming. The fact that anyone survived was because of your actions under fire. Mike shook his head. I failed to save my men. You saved two of them, Master Sergeant Hayes corrected. Danny Morrison and Carlos Vega both lived because you pulled them from that burning vehicle. Carlos lost his leg, but he's alive. He's married now, has two kids, teaches high school in Texas. Danny had some rough years with PTSD, but he's a paramedic in Ohio now, saving other people's lives. Mike stared at them, unable to process what he was hearing. But, but they died. I saw the fire, the explosion. Jason Chen died. Colonel Patterson said gently. He was pinned too deeply, and the second explosion brought down part of the vehicle's frame. But you didn't fail him, Mike. You stayed with him until the very end. The medics found you unconscious, on top of his body. You'd used yourself as a shield to protect him from the flames. The diner was completely silent, except for the sound of Linda crying softly. We recommended you for the Silver Star, Hayes added. But when you were listed as missing and presumed dead, the paperwork got buried. We've been trying to track down what happened to you ever since we learned you might have survived. Do you want to know what Danny Morrison said when we told him we'd found you? Colonel Patterson asked. Mike nodded, not trusting his voice. He said, Sergeant Rodriguez is the reason I'm alive to tuck my kids into bed every night. Whatever he's been doing for the last 20 years, I guarantee he's been helping people, because that's who he is. Tony, who had been listening from behind the counter, spoke up. He was right. Mike's helped more people in this diner than I can count. Never asked for thanks, never wanted recognition, just did what needed doing. That's what real heroes do, Hayes said. They don't stop being heroes when they take off the uniform. They just find new ways to serve. Mike looked around the diner, at Tony, who had given him work without questions, at Sarah, who had tried for years to break through his shell, at Dave, who had understood without needing explanations, at Linda, who was looking at him like she was seeing him for the first time in the 20 years, at Jake, whose anger was slowly being replaced by something that might, eventually, become pride. I don't feel like a hero, Mike said quietly. None of us do, Colonel Patterson replied. That's what makes you one. The news crew arrived the next day, drawn by the story of the missing soldier who had been found alive after 20 years. Mike watched them set up their cameras and lights, transforming Tony's humble diner into a stage for his private pain. You don't have to do this, Linda said, taking his hand. We can go somewhere else. Start over privately. Mike looked at the reporters, then at the photograph they'd brought, the official army portrait that had been shown on the news. In it, he looked young and confident, ready to take on the world and certain he could save everyone. Maybe I do have to do this, he said slowly. Maybe there are other people out there carrying guilt they don't need to carry. Maybe there are other families who need to know that survival isn't something to be ashamed of. He thought of Danny Morrison tucking his children into bed, of Carlos Vega teaching high school students about resilience, of Jason Chen's family finally having closure about their son's last moments. Maybe it's time to stop running. The interview was harder than Mike had expected. Sitting under the bright lights, trying to explain 20 years of guilt and shame to a reporter who had never held a rifle or watched friends die felt like another kind of battle. But he told his story, not as the heroic narrative the reporter wanted, but as the complex, painful truth of survival and guilt, of choices made in impossible circumstances, of the long journey from soldier to waiter to whatever he was becoming now. "What's next for you?" the reporter asked as they wrapped up. Mike looked at Linda, who had agreed to give their marriage another chance, and at Jake, who was working on forgiveness. He looked at Tony, who had offered to make him a partner in the diner, and at the box of letters that had arrived from strangers who had seen the news story, veterans dealing with their own guilt, families of missing soldiers, people who had been inspired by his story of quiet service. "I don't know," Mike said honestly. "For 20 years, I've been focused on surviving each day. Maybe it's time to start thinking about living." 6 months later, Mike Rodriguez still worked at Tony's diner, but everything had changed. The diner had become an unofficial gathering place for veterans in the Chicago area, drawn by word of mouth and the knowledge that here was someone who understood their struggles without judgment. Mike had started a support group that met every Thursday evening after closing time. They called it the Breakfast Club, though they usually drank coffee and shared stories that were anything but lighthearted. Men and women who had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, all of them carrying invisible wounds that matched the visible scar on Mike's forearm. Danny Morrison had driven up from Ohio to attend one of the meetings. When he walked into Tony's diner and saw Mike behind the counter, both men wept openly. 20 years of guilt and gratitude finally finding their voices. "You saved my life, Sergeant," Danny said. "You saved mine too," Mike replied. "Just took me 20 years to realize it." Linda had moved to Chicago, and she and Mike were taking their relationship day by day, rebuilding trust and love that had been interrupted but not destroyed. Jake visited when his army duties allowed, and father and son were slowly learning to know each other as adults. The Silver Star ceremony was scheduled for the following month, but Mike had requested that it be held at the diner rather than at a formal military venue. "This is where I learned what service really means," he had told Colonel Patterson. "This is where I want to be honored." One evening, as Mike was closing up the diner, Sarah asked him the question that had been on her mind for months. "Do you regret it? The 20 years you spent here instead of with your family?" Mike considered the question as he wiped down the counter that had become as familiar to him as his own hands. "I regret the pain I caused Linda and Jake," he said finally. "But I can't regret the life I lived here, the people I met, the service I provided, the peace I eventually found. It all matters. Maybe it needed to happen this way." He looked around the diner, at the booth where he had finally told his story, at the corner where the TV had revealed his secret, at the coffee station where he had spent 20 years providing comfort to strangers. "Maybe there are different kinds of missions," he said. "Maybe some of them require you to disappear for a while before you can truly serve." Michael Rodriguez still gets up at 5:30 a.m. every morning, still arrives at Tony's diner before the sun comes up, still brews the first pot of coffee, and prepares for another day of service. But now, He does it as himself, not as a man running from his past, but as someone who has learned that honor isn't always loud and public. For 20 years, he served his country by serving coffee, by providing a safe space for the lost and lonely, by showing up every day with quiet dignity and reliability. He didn't know he was being heroic. He was just surviving. But sometimes survival itself is an act of courage. The scar on his forearm is still there, still visible when he rolls up his sleeves to work. But it's no longer a mark of shame. It's a reminder of the price of service, of the weight of responsibility, of the bonds between soldiers that transcend time and distance. His story teaches us that honor takes many forms. Sometimes it's displayed on a battlefield with rifles and grenades. Sometimes it's demonstrated in a diner with coffee pots and kindness. Both matter, both serve, both deserve recognition. The greatest heroes aren't always the ones who make the headlines. Sometimes they're the ones who pour your coffee, who remember how you like your eggs, who show up every day without fanfare or recognition, carrying their burdens quietly, and serving others simply because that's who they are. Michael Rodriguez thought he was hiding from honor, but honor had been with him all along, disguised as daily service, as reliability, as the simple act of caring for others, even when he couldn't care for himself. His honor was never untold. It was just spoken in a different language, written in 20 years of small kindnesses and quiet strength. And now, finally, the world can hear it clearly. Have you ever met someone like Michael Rodriguez? Someone whose ordinary exterior hid an extraordinary story of service and sacrifice? Someone who served quietly, without seeking recognition or praise? Share their story in the comments and tell us what city you're watching from. At Honor Untold, we believe that every story of quiet service deserves to be heard. Every hidden hero deserves recognition, and every act of daily courage matters. Subscribe to join our mission of revealing the honor that walks among us every day. Because behind every ordinary face might be an extraordinary story of sacrifice, courage, and untold honor. Until next time, remember, the greatest honor is often the quietest honor, and the best heroes are often the ones who never wanted to be heroes at all.